From 17th century cathedrals to 1960s housing estates, the capital's diverse skyline and what it tells us about the city's past is the focus of a new book, How to Read London, a crash course in London architecture. It's the brainchild of historian Chris Rogers, who I'm very pleased to say joins me on the sofa this evening. Chris, it's a fascinating book.
Thank you.
What makes London such a unique place architecturally to visit?
I think what's really unusual about London is that, unlike a lot of other capital cities in Europe, no one ever planned London, no one ever directed it. It was never subject to a dictator's rule or to a mad monarch who decided that everything should be in one particular way. So it's very much a city that's evolved over time, and it's been subject to various constraints. It's been subject to the whims of private landlords and private landowners, but nobody has ever said, we're going to do it like this. So it's full of small areas that have grown up in organic ways.
The thing I love about this book is having a bit of a flick through earlier today. Some of the things you'd expect to see, some of the beautiful locations that tourists travel around the world to London to see are of course in there, but also some unusual ones too, things like housing estates across the capital. Tell us a bit about some of your highlights.
Well, after the war, a lot of the newly created boroughs started to look at the problem of mass social housing. And of course, London has had a very strong history of creating private housing, if we think of Georgian terraces and even big Victorian townhouses. But after the war, there was a real push towards housing large numbers of people on a big scale. And the problem was always one of how do you get a lot of people in? So it was a question of density. And there were lots of different approaches to that. And places like Camden, for example, decided that instead of building towers, which were already slightly risky, they thought they'd do it in a different way. So, for example, at the Alexandra Road estate, just alongside the main line out of Euston Station, they decided that they would go for a really dense, modern type of terrace. But it looks very different from a Georgian terrace. You have this huge concrete curving wall that follows the curve of the mainline rail line. It's 400 metres long. And instead of being a vertical slice straight up, like a Georgian terrace would be, it steps out and back in what we call the stadium section. So it's a bit like a football stadium. You have a cantilever at the back, and it means everyone gets a good view and a good terrace at the front. So it was a very different approach.
Chris, you clearly know your stuff. This book is designed for people to take out and about with them on the streets of the capital. When you think of the sorts of places that particularly tourists are invited to see and take pictures of in London, housing estates don't perhaps top the list. Should they be?
I think they should, because this was very much a new way of thinking. I called the chapter that particular estate features in The New Elizabethans, because this was a very fresh approach. You had a new bunch of young architects that were very keen to establish their mark, but also to really address a social problem. And if we think, of course, of the problems with housing in London today, it's really interesting to look back and see how previous generations have coped. And because it was always about this idea of density, about fitting in a lot of people, but doing it in a way that was humane and interesting, it's definitely worth a look.
Considering how rich and diverse London's skyline and architecture generally is, how challenging was it to turn this all into a crash course of a pocketbook?
It was a challenge. I'd already had a bit of practice because I'd done a previous book for the Ivy Press called How to Read Paris. And that obviously had its own challenges as well. So it was great to be able to turn to my own city and write about that. I had some ideas at the start about which buildings to feature, and I've managed to squeeze a few of my favourites in as well. But it was really about trying to tell the story of each particular period, because if we think of the Victorians, for example, they did so much for London that it was actually quite hard to narrow that down to a dozen or so buildings and still think about the different types of things that the Victorians put together. So it was a challenge, but there was so much to choose from. You could always find something in each period that tells part of the story.
Having had just a few minutes to flick through the book this afternoon, I found myself getting completely lost in it. What do you hope that people will take from it? Because there is a huge amount of information there.
There is, and I think, I hope the book is accessible enough for people to actually take that in small chunks. It's a very visual book as well as the text, so it's quite easy to look at and to refer to, particularly when you're out on the streets. But I hope people will actually stop, think a bit about the buildings that are in front of them, take a look up, because that's always a good thing to do, and then maybe just start to have a bit of a dig around. There's loads of information on the internet that helps you now through public and private sources, so it's a really good way of actually finding out a bit more about the city around us.
Well, it's an absolutely fascinating read. Even the pictures themselves are fascinating to look at. How and where can people find out more?
The book comes out on the 17th of April, published by the Ivy Press. It's available now to pre-order on various online sites, and I hope people really enjoy it.